My name is Tom, and I've always been skeptical of ghost stories. But when I started working at Grady's Fish and Chips, the oldest chip shop in our small town, I began to reconsider. The shop had been a beloved fixture for decades, but after old Mr. Grady passed away and his disinterested son Dave took over, things changed. I'd worked there during high school and knew the place like the back of my hand, so when Dave offered me a part-time job, I accepted without hesitation. From the moment I walked in, though, I could sense something was off. The air was thick and heavy, and the once welcoming smell of frying fish was tainted with a hint of rot. The first few nights went by without incident, but the strange feeling never left me. I'd hear odd noises, footsteps in the back when I was alone, the fryer turning itself on and off, and sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of something moving in the corner of my eye. I chalked it up to my imagination, but the unease grew stronger with each passing day. One Friday night, Dave asked me to close up. Business had been slow, and by 9 p.m., I was alone. As I wiped down the counters, the lights flickered, casting long shadows across the room. I heard the familiar creak of the storeroom door opening, even though I knew I'd shut it earlier. My heart raced as I walked toward the back, trying to convince myself it was nothing. As I approached the storeroom, I heard a faint whisper my name, spoken so softly I almost thought I imagined it. Tom. I stopped in my tracks, a chill running down my spine. The storeroom door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see something, a dark figure standing in the corner. My stomach dropped as I recognized the face. It was Mr. Grady, his once kindly features now twisted in anger, his eyes hollow and dark. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice cold and otherworldly. I staggered back, the terror freezing me in place. Mr. Grady's ghostly figure stepped forward, his expression growing more menacing with each passing second. My body finally kicked into gear, and I ran sprinting out of the shop, leaving everything behind. I didn't stop until I was in my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I never went back to Grady's Fish and Chips after that night. Dave thought I was crazy, but I didn't care. The shop was eventually sold, and the new owners turned it into a cafe. The haunting supposedly stopped, but the memory of that night stayed with me. Sometimes, I drive past the old chip shop, now bustling with people enjoying their lattes and pastries. But every time I do, I can't help but feel that somewhere in the shadows, Mr. Grady is still there, watching, waiting, and ready to make sure no one ever forgets who truly owned that fryer.
My name is Sarah, and I've always had a love for animals. As a child, I spent countless weekends at Hollow Creek Zoo, a small, run-down place that had seen better days. But despite its shabby appearance, the zoo held a special place in my heart. I hadn't been there in years, not since I left for college, but when I returned to my hometown, nostalgia got the better of me. I decided to visit one last time. The first thing that struck me as I walked through the rusty gates was how quiet the place was. The usual sounds of animals were absent. No chirping birds, no growling lions. It was as if the whole zoo was holding its breath. The air was thick, heavy with a strange smell that I couldn't quite place, like wet fur mixed with something rotten. I wandered through the empty paths, passing enclosures that looked neglected, the cages rusted and overgrown with weeds. The animals were there, but they seemed wrong. The lion in its cage had a dull, lifeless gaze, its once majestic mane matted and thin. The monkeys sat in a corner of their enclosure, unmoving, their eyes following me with an unnerving intensity. The deeper I went into the zoo, the worse the feeling got. I reached the reptile house, a place that always creeped me out as a kid, but curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside. The air was cooler, but the smell was stronger here, more pungent, like something was decaying. The lights inside the reptile house were dim, casting long shadows that made the narrow hallways seem endless. The glass tanks were covered in grime, making it hard to see the creatures inside. I pressed my face close to one of the tanks, trying to make out what was inside. When I saw it, something that didn't belong. It was a snake, but not like any I'd ever seen. Its eyes were too large, almost human, and its body was twisted in unnatural ways. The moment it met my gaze, it slithered closer to the glass, its mouth opening slightly as if it was trying to speak. A shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly backed away, my heart pounding. I turned to leave, but the sound of a low, guttural growl stopped me in my tracks. It was coming from the other end of the hallway. Slowly, I turned around, my blood running cold as I saw something emerging from the shadows. It was a large figure, hunched over, its body covered in matted fur. At first, I thought it was one of the zoo animals that had somehow escaped, but as it stepped into the dim light, I realized it was something far worse. Its face was twisted, almost human, but with sharp, animalistic features. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent intelligence, and its mouth was filled with rows of sharp teeth bared in a snarl. I stumbled back, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The creature let out another growl, this one more aggressive, and began to move towards me. Panic took over, and I bolted for the exit, my footsteps echoing loudly in the narrow hallway. I could hear the creature behind me, its claws scraping against the floor, getting closer with each passing second. I burst out of the reptile house and into the open air, but the sense of safety was short-lived. The entire zoo seemed to be coming alive, the animals stirring in their cages, their eyes following me with a disturbing awareness. I could hear strange noises all around me, growls, hisses, and whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I ran towards the exit, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but when I reached the gate, it was closed, the heavy metal chains wrapped tightly around it. Desperation filled me as I pulled at the chains, but they wouldn't budge. Then from behind me, I heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. I turned around, my back pressed against the gate, and saw the creature from the reptile house standing just a few feet away. It was joined by others now, twisted, monstrous versions of the zoo animals, all with those same malevolent eyes, watching me with predatory intent. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The creatures began to move closer, their growls growing louder, more threatening. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized there was no escape. The last thing I remember is their eyes, glowing in the darkness as they closed in on me. They say Hollow Creek Zoo closed down not long after that, abandoned without explanation. No one knows what happened to the animals, and no one dares to go near the place anymore. But sometimes, on quiet nights, people claim they can still hear the faint sound of growls and whispers coming from the direction of the old zoo. I wouldn't know. I never left.
My name is Jack, and I was never one to believe in the supernatural. When I took a night shift job at the old poultry factory on the edge of town, I wasn't expecting much, just a paycheck and some long hours. The factory itself was a massive, decrepit place, filled with endless rows of conveyor belts, clanking machines, and the overwhelming stench of chicken and blood. The other workers kept to themselves, and there was something about them that seemed off, but I shrugged it off as part of the job. It wasn't until my second week that I started noticing things that didn't add up. One night, as I was working near the processing area, the usual noise of the factory suddenly faded. The clattering of machines, the hum of conveyor belts, the clucking of chickens, it all went silent. The air grew thick and cold, and a strange, rhythmic clucking sound started up from the far end of the room. It was different from the usual noise, more mechanical, almost like a broken record stuck on repeat. I followed the sound, which led me to a door marked restricted access. I had never seen anyone go in or out of that room before. The clucking grew louder, more erratic, as I hesitated in front of the door. My instincts told me to turn back, but something compelled me to open it. Inside, the room was dark and cold, the walls lined with rusty cages filled with chickens. But these weren't ordinary chickens. Their eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and they watched me with an unsettling, almost human-like intelligence. The clucking turned into desperate cries as the chickens began to thrash violently in their cages. Suddenly, one of the chickens spoke, its voice a distorted, guttural whisper, "Help us." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The chicken's cries grew louder, more frantic, and the room seemed to close in on me. The door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. I backed away, stumbling towards a large, metal machine in the corner. As I got closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a heap of mangled remains, a grotesque mix of human and chicken parts twisted together and slick with blood. The machine was grinding bones, feathers, and flesh, the sound growing louder as the room filled with an oppressive, suffocating energy. I turned to run, but the workers were there, blocking the exit, their eyes glowing the same yellow as the chickens. They moved towards me, their faces blank, their movements slow and deliberate, like puppets controlled by unseen strings. Panic surged through me as I realized there was no escape. The last thing I remember is the sound of the machine, the grinding of bones and flesh as the workers closed in, their dead eyes locking onto me. The factory was shut down a few days later, the owner citing unforeseen circumstances. No one talks about what happened, and the building was left to rot. But sometimes, late at night, people claim they can still hear the faint sound of clucking, echoing from deep within the abandoned factory.